I was in Minnesota undergoing treatment when my son sold my classic car repair shop to fund his wife's real estate project. When I got back, he said, "You can fix cars anywhere, Dad." I smiled quietly. "What's so funny?" he snapped. I looked him straight in the eye and said just one sentence. And in that exact moment, the smiles vanished from their faces. No one said another word. But I knew they had just realized they had made a mistake so big it couldn't be undone. If you're still here, I truly appreciate you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story reaches. And honestly, if you were in my place, would you stay silent? Or say something that changes everything? Please note, parts of this story are dramatized and any resemblance is coincidental, but the message may still matter. I stepped out of the cab before it fully stopped. The driver said something probably about the fare, probably about waiting for the car to actually park, but I was already on the sidewalk, hospital bag in hand, standing on a street I had walked 1,000 times before. The October air hit me first. Cold and damp, the way Portland always gets when autumn decides it's done pretending to be summer. I pulled my jacket tighter and looked up. And then I stopped. The sign above the garage was wrong. Not wrong the way a typo is wrong, or the way a faded letter loses its shape over years of weather. Wrong the way a stranger's face is wrong when you're expecting someone you love. The colors were different, some kind of slate gray where the original dark green used to be. The lettering was clean modern, the kind of font you pick from a website template. And the name wasn't mine. It wasn't my father's. It was a name I had never seen before, sitting up there like it had always belonged. I stood on that sidewalk for a long moment. Just stood there. The cab pulled away behind me. I didn't turn around. 3 months. I had been gone exactly 3 months, 92 days in Rochester, Minnesota. Sitting in treatment rooms and hospital hallways in a bed that smelled like antiseptic, no matter how many times the nurses changed the sheets. 92 days of thinking about this garage the way some men think about home. Because for me, for most of my adult life, they had been the same thing. I had pictured walking back through that roll-up door more times than I could count. The way the light falls in through the high windows in the afternoon. The particular squeak of the third floorboard near the back wall. The smell god. The smell 40 years of oil and grease and metal, worked by hand, soaked into every surface, the kind of scent that doesn't wash out because it was never meant to. None of that was here now. I pushed the front door open anyway. The inside had been repainted white walls where there used to be pegboards lined with tools. The floor was clean in a way that floor had never been clean sealed and polished like a showroom. Track lighting overhead. A reception desk near the entrance, the kind with a frosted glass panel and a little silver bell sitting on the counter. A young man looked up from a computer screen, maybe 25, maybe younger, wearing a collared shirt with the new logo on the chest. He smiled the way people smile at strangers who have walked into the wrong place. "Can I help you?" he said. "I'm the previous owner," I said. I kept my voice level. It took more effort than it should have. "This was my garage. Can you tell me what happened here?" He blinked, looked at his screen, looked back at me. I could see him trying to figure out if I was confused or difficult or both. The property was transferred about 6 weeks ago. He said, choosing his words carefully, the way young people do when they're not sure if they're about to have a problem. New ownership took over in early September. All previous contents were cleared and placed in storage per the transfer agreement. "Cleared," I repeated. "Yes, sir." "Everything per the transfer agreement," he said again. Like saying it twice made it mean something different. I looked around the space one more time. The walls, the floor, the ceiling where my grandfather's old pulley system used to hang, which my father had kept and I had kept after him because it worked, and because some things you don't replace just because something newer exists. The pulley was gone. The hooks were gone. There was a small potted plant in the corner where my workbench used to stand. I thanked the young man. He looked relieved. Outside, the afternoon had gotten colder. I sat down on the low concrete step in front of the building, the same step where I used to eat lunch in the summers, where Derek used to sit as a kid and hand me tools through the open door, and I put my hospital bag down beside me and looked at the street. The neighborhood had changed too, though that had been happening for years. The old machine shop across the way was a wine bar now. The vacant lot 2 doors down had become a dog grooming studio with a chalkboard sign out front. Portland had been eating its industrial districts alive for the better part of a decade, turning grease and function into exposed brick and ambiance. I had watched it happen slowly, the way you watch a tide come in, gradual enough that each individual wave looks harmless until you look up and realize the shoreline has moved. My father would have had something dry and quiet to say about all of it. He always did. I sat there for a while, not thinking exactly, more like letting the fact of the thing settle into me the way cold settles into old joints slowly, thoroughly, without asking permission. Then my phone buzzed. A text from my son. 4 words and a period. "Dad, come home. We need to talk." I read it once, then again, not because I hadn't understood it, but because I was looking for something in it, some warmth, some acknowledgement, some version of the message that started with "welcome back," or "how are you feeling," or even just "hey." Something that said, "I know you just spent 3 months getting treated for cancer in a city 8 states away, and I'm glad you made it home." There was none of that, just, "We need to talk." I put the phone in my jacket pocket, picked up my hospital bag, and started walking toward my car. The wind off the river had picked up, carrying that particular Portland October smell, wet leaves and distant rain, and something cold moving in from the coast. I had missed that smell. I had missed this city. I had not missed the feeling I was carrying in my chest right now. But I had learned in 92 days of sitting in rooms where people talked honestly about hard things that the feeling you don't want to face is usually the one most worth facing. So I got in my car. I started the engine, and I drove toward my son's house in the fading October light, already knowing that whatever waited for me, there was not going to be simple, and already knowing that I was going to walk through it anyway. Because that's what you do. You show up, you face it. That's the only thing I ever knew how to do. Somewhere on the drive to my son's house, I stopped telling myself I was going over there to hear an explanation. I knew there wasn't going to be one. Not a real one. Not the kind that makes the thing that happened make sense. But I wasn't ready to sit with that yet. So I let myself drive, and somewhere in those quiet miles, I found myself thinking about the garage the way it used to be. Not the hollow, repainted shell I had just walked out of, but the real thing, the original, the one that took 40 years to build into what it was. So, before I tell you what they did to it, let me tell you what it actually was. My father bought that property in 1971. He was 34 years old, recently arrived in Portland from a small town in eastern Oregon, with enough money saved from 6 years of working at a machine shop to put a down payment on a building that nobody else wanted. The neighborhood was industrial, in the way that word used to mean, something loud, functional, stained with the evidence of actual work. The building smelled like rust and old grease, and the particular dampness of concrete that has absorbed decades of Pacific Northwest rain. Most people walked by and saw a problem. My father walked by and saw a place to start. He built the business slowly, the way men of his generation built everything with patience and with the understanding that shortcuts always cost you more in the end than the time you thought you were saving. By the time I came along, the garage had a reputation in the community for 2 things: honest work and motorcycles nobody else would touch. The older and stranger the machine, the more it interested him. He had a gift for looking at something broken and understanding, not just what was wrong, but why, what failure in the original design, or what years of neglect had led to this particular moment of surrender. He started teaching me when I was 9 years old. My hands were too small for most of the tools. He knew that and didn't care. He would wrap his hands around mine on the wrench and show me the motion, not forcing it, just guiding, and explain what we were doing and why while we did it. He never talked down to me. He never simplified things to the point of inaccuracy. He just used plain language and went slowly, and assumed I was capable of understanding if he took the time to explain it properly. That assumption that a 9-year-old was worth explaining things to shaped the way I thought about people for the rest of my life. When he passed, he left the garage to me inside a trust he had set up in 1993. He didn't explain the trust to me directly the way he explained carburetors and timing belts. He just said in that quiet way of his, "When you need it, you'll know where to look." I thought he was talking about experience. I thought he meant that the knowledge was in my hands and the work in the 40 years of problems solved and engines restored. I didn't understand what he actually meant until much later. The trust had been handled by Ray Daniels, a man I had known peripherally for years, through a mutual friend named Gene, one of the regulars at a coffee shop where a small group of us had gathered on Saturday mornings for longer than I could precisely remember. Ray was an elder law attorney, the kind of lawyer who specialized in protecting people's assets across generations. He was also consistently the quietest man at any table he sat at. He spoke carefully and infrequently, and when he did speak, people tended to listen. My father had trusted him with the paperwork because my father was a good judge of character, and because Ray was the kind of man who treated a document as something serious rather than something routine. For 40 years, I never needed to call him about the garage. The property came to me cleanly when my father passed. No disputes, no complications, no one contesting anything. I just had the key and the work and the life my father had built and handed off. Derek grew up inside those walls. He was maybe 4 years old the first time I brought him in on a Saturday morning, and he spent the whole morning sitting on the floor next to my toolbox, handing me things when I asked and watching with that particular intensity that small children have before the world teaches them to look away from things they find interesting. I taught him the same way my father taught me, with patience, with plain language, with the assumption that he was capable. By the time he was 12, he could change a tire and diagnose a battery problem without being told. By 16, he could handle basic engine work. He had good hands like his grandfather, steady and precise. Then Derek met Tiffany. She came into his life during his late 20s, and she was, I will say this plainly, a compelling person. Smart, well-dressed, the kind of woman who knows exactly how to move through a room and make everyone in it feel slightly off balance in a way they can't quite name. I noticed things the way fathers notice things, but I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself I was just resistant to change to my son, choosing his own life the way sons are supposed to do. The Saturday mornings started getting sparse not long after she appeared. Derek would cancel last minute, or show up late and leave early, or not come at all. I didn't make it a confrontation. That wasn't how we did things. I just noticed the way you notice a season changing gradually, and then all at once. The last time Derek came to the garage alone without her, he stood in the doorway for a minute before he came in, like he was checking whether something had changed. We worked on a '68 Triumph together for a couple of hours without saying much. Then, out of nowhere, he asked me, "Dad, you think this place will ever be worth real money?" I laughed, not dismissively, just genuinely, the way you laugh at a question that seems to be missing the point so completely it becomes almost charming. "It's already worth everything, kid," I said. Derek didn't answer. He just looked at the floor for a moment and then went back to work. I thought he was agreeing with me. I understand now that he was doing something else entirely. He was measuring. I didn't know it then. I know it now. That evening, the one I'm driving through. As I think all of this, I turned onto my son's street without calling ahead, without announcing myself, without any plan beyond the belief that fathers and sons talk to each other when something has gone wrong. That was how it was supposed to work. I still believed that, pulling up to the curb outside his house. I was about to find out how wrong I was. The porch light was on when I walked up. I had parked a half block away out of habit, the kind of habit you develop after decades of arriving at places where you need a moment to collect yourself before walking in. I stood at the bottom of the front steps for a few seconds looking up at the house. It was a nice house. Newer construction, the kind of clean line design that cost more than it looked like it cost. There were no personal touches outside, no worn doormat, no scuff marks on the steps. No evidence of a life that had bumped against the edges of a place and left its mark. Everything was maintained at a careful, deliberate distance from anything that could be called character. I rang the bell, Derek opened the door, and the first thing I noticed was the smile. My son has had a genuine smile his whole life, the kind that starts somewhere behind the eyes and works its way forward. This was not that smile. This one started at the mouth and stopped there like someone had drawn it on with a steady hand and good intentions, but no real understanding of how the thing was supposed to work. "Dad," he said, "you're here. Not glad you made it. Not come on in. I'll get you something. Just the fact of my presence stated back to me like a confirmation of something he'd been told to expect. Tiffany was standing a few feet behind him, a wine glass in her right hand, held at that particular angle that means you've been holding it long enough that it's become part of your posture. She was dressed well. She was always dressed well. And she looked at me with an expression I had to study for a moment before I could name it. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't guilt. It was something closer to readiness. The look of someone who had thought through this conversation in advance and had decided how it was going to go. "Frank," she said warmly, "come in, sit down." The living room was immaculate. Everything in its place, every surface clear, the kind of cleanliness that takes active effort and signals something about the people who maintain it. I sat on the couch. Nobody offered me coffee. Nobody offered me water. I had driven straight from a cross-country flight after 3 months in a medical facility, and I sat on my daughter-in-law's couch in a room that smelled like a candle I couldn't identify. And nobody offered me so much as a glass of tap water. That told me something. Derek sat across from me. He had his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely linked together, and he looked, I want to find the right word for it, he looked rehearsed, like a man who had been coached on what to say, and was now in the uncomfortable position of having to say it in front of the person it was about. He started talking about the investment opportunity, a real estate development project, he said. A strong portfolio, experienced partners, the kind of deal that had a narrow window and required proof of assets to move forward. He used words like capital deployment and asset liquidity and strategic timing, words that belonged in a presentation, not a conversation between a father and son in someone's living room on a Tuesday evening. I listened. I let him finish. I didn't interrupt. Tiffany guided every turn of it. That's the word I kept coming back to watching her. Not participated, not even contributed. She guided it the way a river guides water, not by force exactly, but by the shape of the banks, by making every other direction feel impossible. When Derek paused, she stepped in. When he started to drift towards something that sounded like an apology, she redirected him with a word, or a glance, or a slight shift in her posture that he responded to without seeming to notice he was responding. He wasn't leading the conversation. He was following it, and she was the one deciding where it went. The garage was the most accessible asset, Derek said at one point. And then before I could respond to that, Tiffany's voice came in, smooth and certain and final. "You can fix cars anywhere, Dad." She said it the way you say something you've decided is simply true, not cruel, not defensive, just settled. A conclusion that had been reached and didn't require further discussion. We built something real, something with a future. This is what it looks like when a family actually moves forward. I looked at her. Then I looked at my son, and I smiled. I don't know exactly what it was about that moment that made me smile. Maybe it was the certainty of it, the smoothness of it, the way the whole thing had been packaged and presented like something that should be easy to accept. Maybe it was some instinct deeper than thought, some part of me that recognized the shape of what was happening even before the thinking part of my mind had caught up. Whatever it was, I smiled, and I felt both of them register it. Tiffany's eyebrow went up just slightly. Derek's jaw tightened. "What's funny?" he said. His voice had an edge I hadn't heard before, not quite anger, but close to it. The voice of someone who had prepared for this conversation and was suddenly aware that it wasn't going the way he'd prepared for. I started to answer. "The garage you sold was actually... I meant to say that it had never been theirs to sell. Not because of any legal technicality I was aware of. I didn't know yet what I would discover 2 days later. About the document my father had left inside the frame of a machine he loved and trusted me to find. I meant it the way you mean something when you're speaking from the gut rather than the mind. I meant that some things pass between people in ways that have nothing to do with paperwork. That my father had handed that garage to me, and I had carried it for 40 years, and the fact of that carrying meant something that no transaction could simply erase. I didn't get to finish the sentence. Tiffany stood up. The wine glass was still in her hand, held with the same easy steadiness as when I'd walked in, and her voice had changed, not louder, not harder, just colder. The kind of cold that comes from a decision already made. "Frank," She said, "You've been through a great deal. 3 months of serious treatment. That takes a toll on a person physically and emotionally. What you need right now is rest. We can all sit down when you're feeling more like yourself and have this conversation properly." It was, I will give her this, an impressive maneuver. She had taken my sentence, cut it in half, and replaced the missing half with a suggestion that I wasn't well enough to be trusted with my own thoughts, all delivered in the tone of someone expressing genuine concern. The door closed. Not slammed, that would have been too obvious, just firmly, definitively, with the quiet confidence of someone who had decided the conversation was over and saw no reason to discuss that decision. I stood on the front step in the dark. The neighborhood was quiet. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something it couldn't see. I had come here believing that whatever had happened could be explained, that there had been some mistake in communication, some gap in understanding that a direct conversation could bridge. Fathers and sons talk. They work things out. That's how it's supposed to go. Standing on that step in the cold October dark, I understood that I had been wrong about all of it. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a mistake. The woman on the other side of that door had known exactly what she was doing every step of the way, and she was still doing it right now, and she was very good at it. I walked back to my car. I sat in it for a long time without starting the engine. And I tried to remember if I had ever in 64 years of living felt quite this specific kind of alone. Sitting in that car in the dark outside my son's house, my mind did what minds do when the present becomes too heavy to hold all at once. It went backward, 3 months backward to a room I had spent a long time trying not to think of as the place where everything started to shift. Room 14, B. Mayo Clinic, Rochester, Minnesota. The mattress was firm in the way institutional mattresses always are. Your body stops noticing after the first week because it has no other choice. The ceiling was standard acoustic tile, the kind you find in every medical facility in the country. And I had studied it more times than I could count during the long hours between treatments when sleep wouldn't come and there was nothing to do but wait. The machines beside the bed kept their steady rhythm, and after enough nights that rhythm became a kind of company. Not comforting, just present, which sometimes amounts to the same thing. Early stage prostate cancer, found during a routine screening in late June, which was the only lucky part of any of it. By mid-July, I was in Rochester, because Mayo was where you went when you wanted the best available and were willing to be far from home to get it. The prognosis was good. Caught early treatable, the outcome more dependent on patience than on luck. I understood that. I held on to it through the long days. But understanding something medically and living inside it are two entirely different experiences. Derek called in the first week. Every couple of days, reliable as a schedule, checking in with a kind of dutiful regularity that is its own form of distance. By the second week, the calls thinned out. By the third, mostly texts. Short ones. Hope treatment's going well. Let me know if you need anything. The kind of messages that fulfill the obligation without requiring the sender to be fully present. I told myself he was busy. I was good at telling myself things. It was in the fourth week that I met Harold. He was in the room directly beside mine. I had heard him coughing through the wall before I ever saw his face. First real conversation was in the hallway on a Thursday evening, the chairs near the end window, where patients who couldn't sleep tended to gather. He was 71 years old from a small city in Ohio, and he had the look of a man whose understanding of the world had been rearranged recently and was still being sorted through. His name was Harold, and he had spent 28 years as a high school shop teacher before he retired, which gave us enough common ground to fill several evenings without effort. It took about 3 weeks before he told me the real story. His family had taken everything while he was hospitalized, not dramatically through paperwork. A power of attorney he had signed years earlier, back when signing it had seemed like responsible planning. While Harold was in treatment unable to manage his own affairs, they had used that document to access his accounts, sell his house, transfer his vehicle. By the time he was well enough to go home, there was nothing to go home to. He told me all of it without raising his voice. That was what struck me, the flatness of it, like a man describing weather in a city he no longer lived in. He had processed the anger and the devastation down to something quieter and more durable, the way grief sometimes becomes not smaller, but denser over time. "They'll try to make you look unstable first," he said to me one night, when the hallway was empty and the hospital had settled into its late rhythms. "That's always the first move. Make the person seem like they can't be trusted with their own mind. Once people believe that, they stop listening to what you're actually saying." I looked at him. "My son would never do something like that," I said. Harold looked back at me. He didn't argue. He didn't agree. He just looked at me the way a person looks when they have learned at great personal cost that there is no use arguing with what someone needs to believe before they're ready to let it go. Then he turned back toward the window, and we sat in the quiet together, and neither of us said anything more about it that night. The night before my discharge, I called Derek to tell him I was coming home. Wednesday the 22nd, afternoon flight. I'd take a cab from the airport. There was a pause. Short, maybe 1 second, the kind of gap that disappears entirely in ordinary conversation. Then Derek said, "That's great, Dad. Can't wait to see you." And his voice was warm, and the words were exactly right, except for that 1 second before them. I had spent 3 months in a place that teaches you precision about small things, because small things are sometimes the only things you have any control over. And that 1 second had the texture of a person recalibrating, not surprised by good news, but surprised by timing, making a rapid internal adjustment to something that had shifted without warning. I noticed it the way an experienced mechanic notices an engine note that is almost correct but not quite. I noticed it, and then I told myself I was reading too much into nothing. I put the phone down and looked out the window at Rochester. In late October, the first light snow of the season, dusting the rooftops, the city going pale and quiet at the edges. I prayed. Not formally, just the way a man prays when his instincts are telling him something he doesn't want to hear. I prayed the feeling was wrong, that the 1 second was nothing, that I would step off that plane in 2 days and walk through my garage door and find everything exactly as I had left it. And I looked at that snow for a long time. Then I turned off the light and lay in the dark and listened to the machines keep their rhythm through the night. The next morning came in quietly, the way Portland always delivered its Octobers, a low gray sky pressing down over the rooftops, the smell of rain still sitting in the gutters from the night before. I hadn't slept well. I don't think I expected to. I drove to Dunning's on autopilot, the way your hands remember a road your mind has stopped paying attention to. The corner cafe sat where it always had, wedged between a dry cleaner and a hardware store that had survived 3 recessions by sheer stubbornness. The sign above the door was hand-painted slightly crooked. The letters faded in a way that felt intentional. I'd never once thought about changing it. Some things are exactly right because nobody touched them. I pushed the door open at 7:43 in the morning. The bell above the frame gave its usual 2-note chime. The smell hit me first, dark roast, and something faintly sweet, maybe the cinnamon rolls that Dunning's had been making the same way since before my son was born. They were already there. Jean, Pete, Sal, and Marcus. 4 men sitting around the corner table we had claimed 20 years ago and never formally discussed keeping. My chair, the one with a slightly uneven leg that rocked just enough to keep you honest, was empty. It was always empty when I wasn't there. None of them had ever taken it. I didn't know how to explain how much that meant to me until I saw it again that morning. I sat down without saying anything. The waitress, a young woman named Beverly, who had been working the early shift for 2 years and already knew our orders, brought me a black coffee without being asked. I wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the 4 of them. There was something in their faces I didn't immediately place. Not pity. Not the careful blankness people wear when they're trying to hide bad news. It was something more like readiness. Like they'd been waiting for this conversation and had already decided how to have it. I told them about the garage. All of it, the cab ride, the wrong sign, the young manager who looked at me like I was a stranger, the empty floor where my father's machines used to stand. I told them what Derek had said, and what Tiffany had said, and the way the door had closed on me in the October night. I told it the way you tell a story, when you're still not entirely sure it happened to you. When I finished, the table was quiet for a long moment. Not uncomfortable quiet. The kind that comes from 4 men who've known you long enough to understand that some things need a few seconds of silence before anyone speaks. Then Gene placed his hand flat on the table, an open palm deliberate, the way he did when he wanted you to pay attention to what came next. "Frank," he said, "we already know." I looked at him. He nodded once slowly. "We've known since August." That landed differently than I expected. I'd prepared myself for sympathy. I hadn't prepared myself for witnesses. Sal reached into the front pocket of his jacket, the old canvas one he'd worn every Saturday for as long as I could remember, and set his phone on the table. He turned the screen toward me and scrolled with one thumb. Photo after photo. Nighttime shots, the blue-white glow of his screen, illuminating the familiar storefront from different angles. A flatbed truck in front of the garage at nearly midnight. Men carrying out shelving units. The old sign coming down. The new one going up. Timestamps visible in the corner of every frame. 47 photographs, Sal said. Over 3 weeks. I started taking them the second week of August when I drove past and saw the activity. He set the phone down. I didn't know if it was legal or not. I just knew it didn't look right. So I documented it the way I was trained to document things. Figured you'd need it or you wouldn't. Turns out you do. 47 photographs. 3 weeks of a retired police officer quietly building a record because something felt wrong and he didn't know what else to do. Pete was the next one to speak. He turned his coffee cup in a slow half circle, the way he always did when he was choosing his words carefully. "We talked about calling you," he said. "Back in September, when the sign was fully changed and it was clear this wasn't just a renovation. We spent a whole Saturday right here going back and forth about it." He looked at me steadily. "We decided not to. You were in Minnesota. You were in the middle of your treatment. We didn't want to put that kind of weight on you when you couldn't do anything about it from there." He paused. "I don't know if that was the right call, but that's what we decided." I nodded. I didn't trust myself to say much yet. Marcus had been quiet the whole time, both hands around his mug, looking at the table. He was the youngest of us at 63, a man who chose his words the way a carpenter chose wood, slowly and with an eye for grain. When he finally looked up, something in his expression made me set my own cup down. "There's something else," he said. "About Tiffany." He said her name without any particular edge to it, which somehow made it more serious. "About who she was before she met your son." He didn't say anything more than that. Not yet. The words sat there in the middle of the table, like a tool none of us were quite ready to pick up. I looked at him and understood that, whatever it wasn't small. Before anyone could continue, Gene's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, then typed something quickly with 2 fingers, a brief exchange back and forth, less than a minute. He set the phone face down and reached into his shirt pocket. He placed a business card on the table in front of me. Simple cardstock, clean print, no logo, no flourish. Just a name, a title, and a city. Ray Daniels, elder law attorney, Portland, Oregon. "Ray handles cases exactly like this," Gene said. I reached out to him back in September when the sign changed, showed him the photos described the situation. He told me to wait until you were home. He nodded toward the card. "I texted him a few minutes ago. He already knew you were back. He said to tell you to come over." I picked up the card, turned it over. The back was blank. I looked at the 4 men sitting around that table, Gene with his steady open hands, Pete with his careful eyes, Sal with 47 photographs stored in his jacket pocket, Marcus with something he wasn't ready to say yet but would, and I felt something shift in my chest. I had walked off a plane the day before feeling like a man who had been erased, standing on the sidewalk in front of my own life and not recognizing it, going to my son's house and being told politely and firmly that what I'd spent 40 years building was now a line item in someone else's financial plan. But here at this slightly sticky corner table, with the crooked sign and the cinnamon rolls and the chair that no one had touched in 3 months, something that had been pulled very tight inside me began only just barely to ease. For the first time since the plane had touched down yesterday morning, I didn't feel like I was standing alone. If you're still here, comment "still watching," so I know you're staying with me. And be honest, if you were in my position knowing everything might have been planned long before you returned, would you stay quiet and wait for the right moment, or confront it immediately and risk everything? And just a quick note, parts of what comes next are slightly adapted to deepen the story and its impact. Some details may not fully reflect reality. If this isn't for you, you're free to stop here. Marcus took one more sip of his coffee before he spoke, slow and deliberate the way a man does when he's been turning the words over in his mind for weeks and wants to make sure he gets them exactly right. My sister works in the Burnside building, he said. Different company, same floor as Tiffany's brokerage office. He set his mug down with a quiet precision. She's there every day. She sees people come and go, knows who's doing what kind of business more or less just from proximity. The table was very still. Back in February, Staul, Marcus continued. She was walking past a colleague's desk, someone she barely knew just shared the kitchen with, and she caught a glimpse of an email on the screen. She wasn't trying to read it. It was just there. He paused. The address on the email was Tiffany's. The subject line mentioned a family property, and there was a phrase in the body that stuck with my sister because it seemed like an odd way to describe a real estate timeline. He looked at me directly. The phrase was pending owner availability. I didn't say anything. Not pending medical clearance, Marcus said. Not pending discharge. Owner availability. Like whoever wrote it was planning around an absence. Any absence. Whatever came first. The weight of that settled over me slowly. The way a cold front moves in. You feel the temperature drop before you see the clouds. She didn't think much of it at the time, Marcus said. People in that building talk about deals all day long. But in August, when she drove past the garage and saw the sign had changed, she remembered the email. She told me that same weekend. He looked down at his coffee. I should have pushed harder on what to do with it. We all should have. Nobody argued with him. Nobody told him it was fine. We just sat with it for a moment, because that's what it deserved. Tiffany had started building this in February, 8 months before I came home. 4 months before I walked into a doctor's office and got the news that sent me to Minnesota. She hadn't known I'd be sick. She hadn't planned around a diagnosis. She had simply built a plan that could move whenever I was out of the way for any reason for any length of time and then waited for the moment to arrive. My illness had just been the one that did. I followed the address Jean had written on a paper napkin to a building on the western edge of downtown Portland. The kind of old brick structure that had survived every wave of urban renovation by simply being too solid to tear down cheaply. 3 floors, narrow hallways. The elevator was a relic, but it worked. Ray Daniels' office was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a corridor lined with framed Oregon bar admissions and a single landscape watercolor that looked like the Columbia River Gorge in early spring. The door was open. He was already at his desk. He was a lean man in his early 60s, gray at the temples, and dressed in the kind of press shirt that suggested someone who still believed presentation was a form of respect. The office smelled like old paper and coffee that had been sitting on the burner for too long, which I found immediately reassuring. The bookshelves behind him ran floor to ceiling, packed with volumes arranged by subject rather than size, with handwritten tabs sticking out at irregular intervals. A man who actually used his library. He stood when I came in, shook my hand with a firm, dry grip, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. Jean told me the outline, he said, settling back into his seat. I'd like to see the documents. I had brought everything I'd been able to gather since returning the sale notification letter that had been forwarded to my old address. A copy of the transfer filing from the county records office that Ray had already pulled, and the photograph Sal had sent to my phone of the notarized power of attorney used to execute the sale. Ray read without speaking. He didn't react visibly. He turned the pages with the careful hands of someone who had handled enough paperwork to know that a document's weight was rarely in its most obvious line. When he finished, he set the papers flat on the desk and looked at me. The notary seal is legitimate, he said. The notary is a real licensed professional in Multnomah County, but the signature on this power of attorney is not yours. He said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis clearly without softening it, because you need the accuracy more than you need the comfort. How do you know? I asked. Because I've seen your signature before, he said. On the trust documentation your father had drawn up in 1993. I was a junior associate at the firm that handled it. I was 28 years old, and I filed the paperwork myself. He tapped the document in front of him. The formation of letters, the pressure, the way you close the loop on the capital F, it doesn't match. Whoever signed this practiced the signature. They got close, but not close enough. I had known Ray Daniels for 20 years as Gene's quiet friend, who sometimes joined us for coffee and never talked about work. I had not known until that moment that he had been connected to my family's paperwork for over 3 decades. Tiffany runs the brokerage that handled the listing. Ray continued, leaning back slightly. The developer who purchased the property had worked with her on 2 previous deals. He trusted the documentation she presented because he'd never had reason not to. He didn't run independent verification on the power of attorney because the notary seal checked out and the relationship gave him confidence. Ray's voice was measured and even. That's the mechanism, manufactured trust, layered over a forged instrument. He picked up a pen and turned it slowly between 2 fingers. Before title insurance became standard practice for inherited property in Oregon, families used other mechanisms to protect generational assets. He said, "Your father was an unusually careful man. He didn't just deed you the garage, he placed it inside a revocable trust in 1993 and converted it to irrevocable status before he passed. That trust is the actual title holder of record." He looked at me steadily. "A power of attorney, even a legitimate one, cannot authorize the sale of an asset held in an irrevocable trust without trustee approval. The trustee in this case is you." I sat with that for a moment, which means the sale was not legally executable under the instrument used to conduct it, Ray said. "Correct." He let me process that. Then he set the pen down, folded his hands on the desk, and asked the question I hadn't seen coming. "Frank," he said, "your father's 1958 Harley Davidson. Where is it right now?" Jimmy Kowalski's shop sat at the end of a long street on Portland's east side, the kind of block that developers hadn't gotten around to yet because the owners were too settled to be moved. The roll-up metal door was open when we arrived. I heard the shop before I saw it, the faint hiss of an air compressor cycling down the tick of cooling metal. I pushed through the side entrance and the smell stopped me in the doorway. Motor oil, warm steel, old rubber. The particular layered scent of a place where someone has been doing careful work for a very long time. I stood there for just a moment and breathed it in. Ray stepped in behind me and didn't say anything. I think he understood. Jimmy was at the back bench, a magnifying visor pushed up on his forehead. He was a broad-shouldered man with hands built for mechanical work, wide-palmed, sure-fingered, permanently stained at the knuckles in a way that went deeper than soap could reach. When he saw me, he set down what he was holding, crossed the floor in 4 steps, and put one hand briefly on my shoulder. No speech. Just the grip of a man who means it. "Good to see you upright," he said. "It's good to be upright," I said. I introduced Ray. Jimmy nodded once the nod of a man who had already connected the pieces and arrived at the right answer before the question was asked. "I figured something like this was coming," he said. "Come on back." The motorcycle was in the far corner, covered with a white canvas drop cloth. Jimmy had kept it away from the main workspace, positioned carefully with clear space around it. He'd been holding it since August when I'd called him from the hospital and asked without explaining. He hadn't asked me to explain. He lifted the canvas back in folded sections. The 1958 FL Duo Glide emerged piece by piece, original chrome, 2-tone burgundy and cream paint my father had chosen and never redone. The same leather seat profile my father had always returned to after every repair. I stood in front of it and didn't speak. "Your son came by twice," Jimmy said. "September and early October. Asked whether the bike was here, whether you'd been in contact, whether I was holding it on your behalf." He crossed his arms. I told him both times that anything on my premises was none of his concern without written documentation from you. He didn't have any. A pause. Second time, he brought a woman with him. She did most of the talking, very composed, very certain. He looked at me evenly. I told her the same thing. I didn't need to ask who the woman was. My father used to say it while showing me how a machine holds together, how it keeps what matters safe inside its own structure. The most important things don't live in a safe. They live where only the right hands will think to look. Ray crouched beside the lower section of the frame, with a small flashlight tracing the auxiliary subtube that ran beneath the backbone. He looked up at me, once then at Jimmy. May I?" he asked. Jimmy handed him a socket wrench without a word. 20 minutes. The three of us working together, Ray holding the light. Jimmy guiding the placement, me steadying the frame. The end cap on the subtube came free cleanly. Inside, packed against the inner wall, was a length of sealed PVC pipe wrapped in overlapping layers of waterproof tape, the work of someone who intended it to last decades. Jimmy passed me a box cutter, one clean cut. A roll of documents bound with a brittle rubber band slid into my palm. Ray spread them flat on the workbench, Jimmy holding the edges. He read in complete silence. When he finished, he kept his hands resting on the paper. "Original trust instrument," he said quietly. "Handwritten notarized witnessed, dated March 14th, 1993. Your signature as successor trustee." He looked up. "Your father kept this out of the public record system deliberately. He didn't want it showing up in a routine title search. He told me at the time that he didn't trust the idea of anyone looking up what his son owned and deciding to want it." A pause. He was right. I already knew what came next, but I asked anyway. "What does this mean for the sale?" "It means they sold something that was never legally theirs," Ray said. "Not 1 square inch of it. The trust holds the title. The sale cannot stand." He rolled the documents carefully and held them against his chest. "We file tomorrow morning." I put my hand on the fuel tank. The chrome was cool and smooth. My father's hands had rested in this exact place more times than I could count. And mine had too. And now, here we were, 67 years after this machine was built, and it had kept the thing my father put inside it exactly where he'd left it. I didn't say anything. I just stood there with my palm on the metal and let that be enough. I was home before 9. I heated soup I didn't want and sat at the kitchen table with Ray's sealed envelope on the chair beside me. I hadn't told anyone about the documents except Ray. Derek didn't know they existed. Nobody did. The phone rang at 11 past 11. Derek's name on the screen. His voice was different, not the composed, rehearsed version from 2 nights ago at his front door. Quieter. Something underneath the surface pressing up. "Dad," he said. "I've been thinking. I think I made a mistake. Then I heard her in the background. Low quick. The shift in Derek's voice was immediate, the uncertainty smoothed over, replaced by something flat and careful that didn't sound like him. "We can talk later," he said, "when you're settled." The call ended. I sat with the silence for a moment. He hadn't known about the Harley, hadn't known about the documents. His call had nothing to do with any of it, just a man's conscience surfacing for a few seconds before something pulled it back under. I thought about the sentence he hadn't been allowed to finish. Later, I moved to the car. The rain had come in off the coast soft and steady, running down the windshield in thin streams glowing faintly under the streetlight at the end of the driveway. I sat in the dark and thought about the voice I'd heard before it changed. Not the version of my son who'd stood in his living room explaining investment strategies. The other one. The one that sounded just for a moment like the boy who used to fall asleep in the back seat on the drive home from the garage, one hand still holding a wrench he'd forgotten to put down. A grown man caught inside a decision larger than he'd understood when he agreed to it. The rain kept falling. I didn't start the engine. The phone rang at 7:40 in the morning while the coffee was still brewing. Ray didn't say good morning. "Frank," he said, "they filed for conservatorship Friday afternoon. We have 72 hours. I set the coffee mug down on the counter and stood very still for a moment, the way you do, when your body understands something before your mind has finished processing it. Outside, Portland was doing what it did on late October mornings. Gray sky, wet streets. The kind of steady quiet that feels ordinary right up until it isn't. "I'll be there in 40 minutes, I said. Ray had the filing spread across his desk. By the time I arrived, multiple documents, tabbed with color-coded adhesive strips in the methodical way of a man who had been anticipating this for longer than I had. He walked me through each section without editorializing, which I appreciated. Facts first, reaction later. The legal mechanism was straightforward, and the threat of it was equally straightforward. If the conservatorship petition was approved by a Multnomah County judge, I would lose independent legal authority over my own finances, my medical decisions, and my property. Every significant choice would require approval from a court-appointed conservator, who the petition suggested should be Derek. Ray explained it in plain language the way a good attorney does when he wants you to understand the full weight of what's in front of you. Then he handed me the section of the filing that described me. I read it once. I read it a second time. The document stated that I showed signs of cognitive decline, following extended medical treatment, a history of emotional instability, and a demonstrated inability to manage personal assets in a responsible manner. I set the page down flat on the desk. My hands were steady. I noticed that specifically that they were steady, and I thought it was worth noting even just to myself. "How long has this been in preparation?" I asked. Ray leaned back in his chair. "The language is too polished for something drafted in a weekend. The supporting declarations were notarized more than 3 weeks ago before you returned to Portland." He let that sit for a moment. "This was ready and waiting, Frank. She knew you'd come back. She knew you'd push back. This was the contingency." I looked at the filing date in the upper right corner of the first page. Friday, October 24th, 2025. The same evening Derek had called me, voice unsteady, and started to say something before Tiffany's voice cut in from the background. "She prepared the filing while he was on the phone with me," I said. "Or immediately after," Ray said. "The timestamp on the electronic submission is 8:57 in the evening." "There's something else?" Ray said. He turned to a section near the back of the filing supporting documentation letters from what appeared to be professional references and medical adjacencies. "The petition references your treatment records in a general way, specifically the documented cognitive side effects of certain cancer therapies. The language is accurate enough to sound informed." She doesn't have access to my records," I said. "She doesn't need detailed records to build a general profile," Ray said. "The cognitive effects of specific cancer treatments are documented in public medical literature. Anyone can read them. She built the framework from publicly available information." He paused. "But the specificity of some of the language suggests she also had access to something more direct." He explained what he'd been able to piece together. In September, someone had called the main line of my primary care physician's office in Portland, identifying herself as Derek's wife, expressing concern about her father-in-law's condition. During treatment, asking general questions about what patients typically experienced at this stage. The receptionist not recognizing any wrongdoing in a general wellness inquiry from a family member had shared non-specific but confirmatory information. "It's a gray area legally," Ray said carefully, "but it's also a pattern using a family relationship as a credential to extract information that would otherwise be protected. I'm flagging it as a potential privacy violation to add to the record." He made a note in the margin of his legal pad. "We won't lead with it, but we won't ignore it either." I thought about that for a moment. Tiffany had called my doctor's office months ago, while I was still in Minnesota, while Derek was still leaving me voicemails that started with just checking in. Dad and she had been building the architecture of this filing brick by careful brick. Jean arrived at Ray's office just before noon. He'd driven over without being asked, which was exactly the kind of thing Jean did. He had a folded piece of paper in his shirt pocket that he placed on the desk between us, without ceremony. 12 names on that list, he said. 12 neighbors who received handwritten letters from Derek in the past 2 weeks. I've spoken to 8 of them personally. They all said the same thing. The letter expressed concern about your mental and emotional state since returning from treatment, asked them to be watchful, and encouraged them to reach out if they observed anything troubling. I looked at the list. I recognized every name on it, people I'd lived among for 22 years. "He asked the neighbors to watch me," I said. "He asked them to report on you," Jean said. There was no anger in his voice, just precision. I looked at the filing on Ray's desk. Then I looked at Jean's list. Then I heard Harold's voice in my head, the quiet certainty of a man who had sat in a hospital hallway at 2 a.m. and told me exactly how this worked. They'll try to make you look unstable first. word for word. He had described this filing before it existed. He had told me from his own experience what the opening move looked like, and I had sat in that hospital room and said, "My son would never do that." I didn't say anything out loud, but I let myself sit with the weight of that for a moment, the distance between what I had believed and what was currently spread across Ray's desk in color-tabbed sections. "What do we do?" I asked. Ray picked up his pen. "We move faster than they planned for. The petition assumes you'll be reactive, that you'll consult an attorney, file a response, and wait for a hearing date. Standard timeline gives them weeks to build supplementary declarations and pressure the neighbor relationships Gene just described." He looked at me directly across the desk. "I want you at Oregon Health and Science University tomorrow morning. First available appointment for a certified neurological assessment, the kind conducted by an independent licensed evaluator with no connection to either party." He wrote the name of a department and a contact on a notepad page and slid it across. "We get the evaluation before they schedule theirs. We walk into any hearing with documentation they cannot preempt." I took the paper. "They're going to argue the assessment is self-serving," I said. "They're going to argue everything," Ray said simply. "That's what they're paid to do. Our job is to make sure the record tells the truth louder than they can argue against it." I nodded. I folded the paper and put it in my jacket pocket. Then I turned toward the window, the third-floor view over a stretch of Portland I'd known most of my adult life, the low rooftops and the familiar grid of streets running west toward the river. I stood there for a moment and thought about my son, not the version who had signed a legal document he didn't fully read, the version underneath the one whose voice had broken slightly at 11 past 11 on a Friday night before someone else's certainty replaced it. I wondered if he understood what he'd put his name on. I wondered if it would matter by the time he did. The chair in the assessment room at Oregon Health and Science University was hard plastic, the kind designed without any particular interest in comfort, and the overhead lights were the flat white of fluorescent bulbs that made everything look slightly more clinical than it needed to be. I sat with my hands folded on the table in front of me and waited. Dr. Patricia Wren came in at exactly 8 o'clock. A composed woman in her late 40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a clipboard she carried with the practiced ease of someone who had done this particular thing several thousand times. She introduced herself, explained the evaluation process in a clear and methodical way, and then looked at me with an expression of complete professional neutrality. "Shall we begin?" she said. "Yes," I said. "Let's." The assessment ran 2 hours and 12 minutes. I know the exact duration because there was a clock on the wall directly in my line of sight, and I watched it the way I used to watch a pressure gauge on an engine, not obsessively just aware. Dr. Wren moved through categories with quiet efficiency: memory, sequential, recall, delayed, recall, pattern recognition. Language verbal, fluency comprehension, the ability to retrieve specific words under mild time pressure. Spatial reasoning, mentally rotating objects, reading dimensional relationships from flat diagrams. Problem solving, working through multi-step mechanical scenarios, identifying failure points in a described system. About 40 minutes in, she paused between sections and looked up from her clipboard. "You said earlier that you've spent 40 years restoring vintage motorcycles," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "That's right," I said. "Can you describe what that work requires on a daily basis?" I thought about it for a moment, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to give her the accurate one, rather than the simplified one. "Every model is different," I said. "Different engineering logic, different tolerances, different failure patterns. You carry a few hundred of them in your head, after enough years not memorized the way you'd memorize a list, but understood. The way you understand how a person walks and can tell when something's off before they say anything." I paused. "You diagnose by sound and feel as much as by measurement. A misfire in a 1948 Indian sounds different from the same problem in a 1962 Triumph. You know which one you're hearing before you open the hood." Dr. Wren made a note. Then she said something I wasn't expecting. "What you're describing, the integration of fine motor precision with complex mechanical pattern recognition, functions as a significant form of cognitive exercise. Extended engagement with that kind of work builds and maintains neural pathways associated with memory, spatial processing, and executive function. She looked at me with the same neutral expression she'd worn since she walked in. It's a meaningful form of protection for cognitive health, Mr. Calloway, particularly over decades. I nodded. I didn't say anything, but I filed that away. The results came back to Ray's office by 3 p.m, a formal written evaluation on OHSU, letterhead 4 pages with scoring metrics and comparative percentiles. Ray read it standing at his desk, which was unusual for him. When he finished, he set it down and looked at me across the room. He smiled. It was the first time I'd seen him smile since any of this began. Above average across every category, Mrs. Pint, he said. Compared to your age cohort, memory, language, spatial reasoning, executive function, all above the normative range for a 64-year-old male. He picked up the report and held it at an angle as if appreciating its weight. Their petition just became a liability for them. He made the call to Derek's attorney that afternoon. I sat in the chair across from his desk and listened to one side of the conversation, Ray's measured. Even voice explaining that an independent certified neurological assessment had been completed and the results would be entered into the court record, and that any opposing evaluation conducted at a later date would be evaluated in the context of this prior independent finding. When he hung up, the office was quiet for a moment. I don't have a precise word for what I felt sitting there. Not triumph, that wasn't the right scale for it. Something smaller and more fundamental. The particular relief of a man who has been told by people with credentials and instruments and no stake in the outcome that the thing he knew to be true about himself is in fact true. That his mind was his own. That it had been his own all along. Something in my chest that had been held tight since Monday morning began very carefully to ease. I was home by 6. I heated dinner, sat at the table, and read through the OHSU report myself slowly, the way you read something you want to actually understand rather than just confirm. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its Tuesday evening quiet, porch lights coming on, a dog somewhere down the block making its opinion known, Portland doing what it did. At 9:47 I heard it, a sharp crack. Then the sound of glass landing on the hardwood floor of my bedroom, not shattering exactly, but a cascading sound pieces arriving in sequence. I was out of the kitchen chair and in the hallway before I had consciously decided to move. The bedroom window had a fist-sized hole near the upper left corner, a clean circular break with lines running outward from the center. A piece of broken concrete, roughly the size of a large fist, sat on the floor beside the bed, surrounded by glass. I stepped to the window and looked out at the street, empty. A car moving away at the far end of the block, nothing distinctive about it, no plates visible in the darkness. My phone rang 4 minutes later. Ray. I just heard, he said. I didn't ask how he'd heard that fast. Ray had his ways. Are you all right? The window is broken, I said. I'm not. Good. A pause. Frank, I want to say something clearly. That wasn't Tiffany's style. This isn't her kind of move. His voice was careful but direct. The developer has a significant amount of money tied up in this transaction. If the sale is reversed, he doesn't just lose the property. He loses the timeline on a larger project that was built around acquiring this parcel. We're talking about a real financial consequence for someone who's used to not having those. Another pause. Someone with more to lose than Tiffany sent that message tonight. I looked at the hole in my bedroom window. They threw a rock through my window to tell me to back down, I said. Yes, Ray said, which means they're concerned enough to do it. That's useful information. He told me to document everything. Photograph the window, the concrete, the floor, the position of the piece relative to the point of entry, and said he'd handle the formal reporting in the morning when it could be attached to existing filings. I did what he said. I've been doing what he said for 5 days now, and so far he's been right about everything. Gene called 10 minutes after Ray. Pete called 2 minutes after Gene. Neither of them asked many questions. We're coming over, Gene said. You don't have to, I said. We know, he said. I don't know exactly what time they arrived because by then I'd turned the bedroom light off and moved to the living room with a book I wasn't really reading. But sometime around 11, I heard the familiar sound of Jean's truck settling onto the street outside, and a few minutes later, Pete's sedan pulled in behind it. I looked out the front window and saw the two of them not standing on the porch, not knocking, just parked, settled in, present. I went to bed around midnight and slept better than I had any right to. In the morning, I made coffee enough for 3 and carried 2 mugs out to the street. Jean rolled down his window. Pete was asleep in the passenger seat, head against the glass, which I chose not to mention. I handed Jean both mugs, and he passed one across without waking him. We stood there for a moment in the early morning, quiet, the gray October light coming in low over the rooftops, the street still mostly empty, the coffee sending small threads of steam up into the cold air. Neither of us said anything about why they were there. Neither of us needed to. The morning came in gray and cold, the way late October in Portland insists on reminding you that the season has turned and is not turning back. I drove to Ray's office with the heater running and the radio off, which was how I preferred to think. Ray was already at his desk when I arrived. He didn't say good morning. He picked up a manila folder, thick tab the kind that takes time to assemble, and placed it flat on the desk between us with both hands. The way you set something down when you want the other person to understand its weight before they open it. I found her, he said, who she actually is, before your son, before Portland. I sat down and looked at the folder. Tell me, I said. His name was Leonard Hayes, 74 years old, currently residing in an assisted living facility in Scottsdale, Arizona. Before that, for most of his working life, he had been a structural engineer in Phoenix, the kind of man who built things that were meant to last and lived accordingly. His wife of 31 years had passed away from a prolonged illness when Leonard was 66. He had 2 adult children from that marriage, both living out of state, both with their own families and their own distances. Tiffany had entered his life approximately 6 years ago when she was 29 and he was 68. Ray walked me through the timeline with the same measured pace he used for everything, not rushing toward the conclusion, letting each piece land before he placed the next one. She had come in through a real estate transaction, a smaller deal, nothing significant but enough to establish contact and build familiarity. Over the following months, the relationship had shifted. She was attentive, organized, capable. She had a way of making herself necessary before anyone had decided to need her. Leonard's children, living their lives at a geographical remove, had been relieved that their father had found someone reliable. Within a year of the marriage, Leonard's longtime friends had mostly stopped calling, not because of any dramatic falling out, nothing that obvious. Just a gradual reduction in availability, a series of scheduling conflicts, a slow and unremarkable narrowing of his circle until the people who had known him for decades were no longer present in his daily life. Then came the questions about his judgment, not accusations, Ray said carefully. Questions, expressed concerns, the kind of thing that, if repeated often enough by someone you trust, begins to sound like it might have something to it. He looked at me steadily. She didn't call him unstable. She asked in front of others whether he'd remembered correctly, whether he was sure, whether perhaps he was more tired than he realized. The divorce came 3 years into the marriage. By then, a series of financial instruments had been reorganized, accounts restructured, a property transferred. Nothing that couldn't be explained individually as a reasonable decision. Collectively, it told a different story. Leonard came out of it with significantly less than he'd gone in, with a damaged relationship with his children, who hadn't understood what was happening until afterward. And something else, something Ray mentioned last and quietly. I spoke with him yesterday afternoon, Ray said. By telephone. He was willing to talk. A pause. He told me the worst part wasn't the money. I waited. He said the worst part was how close he came to believing her, when she told him he was losing his grasp on things, that his memory wasn't reliable, that the people around him were concerned. Ray kept his voice even. He said there were weeks, whole weeks, where he genuinely wasn't sure anymore, where the question she had planted started to feel like it might be the answer. The office was quiet for a moment. I looked at the folder, then at the window, then back at Ray. Derek doesn't know any of this, I said. It wasn't a question. No, Ray said. I don't believe he does. I thought about that, about what it meant to be 38 years old, and standing inside a situation you only partially understood, having made decisions based on a version of reality that had been constructed for you by someone who knew exactly what she was building. But Ray, I said, not knowing and choosing not to look too closely at some point, those become the same thing. Ray was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. At some point they do. I sat with that for a while after he said it. Not angrily, there wasn't room for anger in what I was feeling, which was something more complicated and less clean. I was thinking about a phone call at 11 past 11 on a Friday night. A voice starting a sentence it wasn't allowed to finish. I was thinking about a 23-year-old version of my son standing in the garage with a wrench in his hand, asking questions about engines, genuinely wanting to understand how things worked. I was thinking about how much distance there was between that person and the one who had signed a conservatorship petition, without reading it carefully enough to know what he was authorizing. And I was thinking about a folder sitting in Ray's desk that Derek had never seen. The Leonard Hayes documentation, I said. If Derek read it, it would be difficult to look away from, Ray said. He wasn't encouraging me. He wasn't discouraging me either. He was just stating the fact. I thought about the right way to do this. Not through lawyers, not through a hearing room, not in a place where Tiffany could manage the environment, the language, the framing of whatever was said. I needed to talk to my son the way men are supposed to talk to each other, without an audience, without a script, without someone else in the room making sure the conversation went the way they had planned. I want to meet with him alone, I said, without her anywhere nearby. And Ray looked at me. That's going to be difficult to arrange. I know, I said. That's why I'm not asking her permission. I picked up my phone and typed a message to Derek. Short, direct. The kind of message that doesn't leave room for negotiation or delay. The parking lot behind your office building. Sunday at 2 in the afternoon. Come alone. I sent it before I had finished putting my jacket on. Ray watched me stand and button the coat. Be careful, Frank, he said. I nodded. I pulled the collar up against the morning cold and looked at him from the doorway. Careful and quiet aren't the same thing, I said. I've been quiet long enough. I walked out into the gray October morning and got in my car and drove home and waited for my son to respond. 4 days of silence. I sent the text on Wednesday morning and then I waited. I didn't follow up. I didn't call. I didn't ask Ray to reach out through Derek's attorney to confirm receipt. I just sent the message and went home and let the silence be what it was, which was either Derek deciding whether to come or Tiffany deciding whether to let him. On Thursday, nothing. On Friday, nothing. Saturday came and went with a quiet that felt almost deliberate, the kind that has weight to it. I spent most of the weekend in the spare room, going through old receipts and documentation. Ray had asked me to organize paper records mostly. The kind that tell the story of 40 years of business in ways that no electronic file quite manages. I didn't think too much about Sunday, or I tried not to. His car pulled into the lot at 5 minutes to 2. The parking lot behind Derek's office building sat on the eastern edge of the block, a flat concrete rectangle with painted lines that had faded to suggestions, bordered on 2 sides by the back walls of neighboring buildings, and on the third by a chain-link fence with a strip of overgrown grass behind it. On a Sunday afternoon in early November, it was empty except for my truck and now Derek's car, a dark gray sedan I didn't recognize, which meant he'd bought it sometime in the past year without mentioning it. He got out slowly. He saw me standing beside my truck and stopped moving for a moment, one hand still on the door frame, his weight not quite committed to the forward direction. I watched him make the calculation. I didn't move. I just stood there with my hands in my jacket pockets and waited for him to decide. He decided to come. He looked different from the night he'd stood in his own doorway and explained real estate investment strategies to me in a voice that didn't quite fit his face. Less composed. His jacket was the right kind for the weather, but he'd buttoned it unevenly, which was the kind of thing Derek never did. There were marks under his eyes that spoke of nights that hadn't gone well. I gestured toward the hood of my truck with one hand. He came and sat on it beside me, about 2 feet of distance between us, the way you'd sit next to someone you weren't sure of yet. 2 men who had forgotten how to be close to each other, sitting in a parking lot on a gray November Sunday, figuring out where to start. I let the quiet go for a moment. Sometimes silence is the most honest opening. You got the SEC letter, I said, not a question. He turned his head to look at me. Friday, he said. How did you... I didn't, I said. I just knew it was coming. I looked out at the chain link fence. You came here carrying two things you didn't know how to hold. I figured that was part of what got you out of the house. He didn't confirm it, and he didn't deny it. He just looked at his hands for a moment. The development project, he said. The one the garage money went into. He stopped, started again. The SEC has questions about how the land acquisition was structured. There are concerns about certain representations made to investors. His voice was careful the way it gets when a person is relaying information they've been trying not to fully absorb. Tiffany handled all of that side of it. I signed things. I wasn't... He stopped. You didn't read them carefully enough, I said. He was quiet. No, he said. I didn't. I let that sit. Then I reached into the truck bed and pulled out the folder, the one Ray had assembled, the one with Leonard Hayes' name on the divider tab. The documentation from Phoenix that told a story 6 years older than anything Derek knew about. I placed it on the hood between us. I need you to read something, I said. I'm not going to tell you what to think about it. I'm not going to stand here and make a case. I'm going to let you read it, and then you can tell me whatever you want to tell me. Derek looked at the folder. He didn't touch it for a moment, just looked at it the way you look at something, when you already suspect you're not going to like what's inside. Then he opened it. I stepped away and leaned against the chain link fence while he read. I didn't watch his face. I looked at the strip of overgrown grass behind the fence, at the way the wind moved through it in slow, irregular waves, at a plastic bag caught in the lower links that had been there long enough to fade. I listened to the sound of pages turning. I listened to when the turning stopped. The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to hear the wind move through the empty lot in a slow, full circuit. Where did you get this? Derek said finally. Ray Daniels, I said. He found it. He spoke with the man in person. Derek was looking at the open page in front of him. This is from 6 years ago. Yes, I said. Before she and I... Yes. Another silence. Longer this time. Even if this is all accurate, he said, and his voice had shifted into something careful, something that was working very hard to stay measured. Dad. I can't, there are things that are already in motion. I know, I said. I pushed off from the fence and walked back toward the truck. I stood across from him with the folder between us on the hood. I'm not asking you to make a decision right now. I'm not asking you to do anything tonight. I'm asking you to see things clearly. I looked at him directly the way I used to look at him when he was young, and I needed him to understand something that mattered. That's all I'm asking, just to look at it without the version of events you've been given. He closed the folder. He sat there for a moment with both hands flat on it, not moving. Then he stood and picked up his keys from beside him on the hood and walked back toward his car. I didn't call after him. I just watched him go the particular walk of a man carrying more than he came, with moving through the gray November air toward a car he'd bought in a year, where everything had quietly gone wrong. He got in. The engine started. Then it stopped. The door opened. I heard his footsteps on the concrete, unhurried, deliberate coming back across the lot. He reached the front of my truck and picked the folder up off the hood without looking at me, tucked it under his arm, walked back to his car and got in, and this time the engine stayed running. I watched the sedan until it turned out of the lot and disappeared. Then I stood alone in the empty concrete rectangle with the faded lines and the chain link fence and the wind moving through in slow circuits, and I felt something that wasn't quite hope, not yet. Not enough for that word, but was close enough to it that I didn't want to look at it too directly in case it went away. I stood there for a while. Then I got in my truck and drove home. The phone rang at 5 in the morning, while it was still full dark outside. I'd been half awake already, the kind of shallow sleep you get when your mind hasn't fully agreed to rest. So when the screen lit up with Sal's name, I had it in my hand before the second ring. His voice was the voice of a man who had spent 3 decades delivering bad news before sunrise. Calm, clear, no wasted syllables. Frank, get dressed. Meet me at the garage right now. I was in my truck 11 minutes later. The garage sat at the end of its block the way it always had. Except that at 5 in the morning, with 2 police cruisers parked at angles in front of it and their lights running in slow red and blue rotations across the building, it looked like a different place entirely. The kind of place where something had just happened. Sal was standing on the sidewalk with his hands in his coat pockets, talking to a uniformed officer I didn't recognize. He saw me coming and broke off the conversation, meeting me at the edge of the sidewalk with the same economical manner he brought to everything. "Walk with me," he said. We moved to the side of the building, away from the cruisers and the activity near the front entrance. In the gray pre-dawn quiet, Sal told me what had happened, in the same order it occurred without editorializing. He had been on his morning walk at 4:45, same route, same time, every day for 11 years. The kind of habit that outlasted his badge and his shift schedule, and probably would outlast most other things. He came down the block where the garage sat and saw light moving inside. Not the steady light of an overhead fixture, the moving light of handheld devices sweeping across surfaces in the particular way of people looking for something specific. He called it in before he did anything else. Then he waited across the street and watched until the cruisers arrived 4 minutes later. The officers found 2 men inside, both through a rear service door that had been worked open with a tool that left the marks on the frame. They were in the back section of the garage where the previous owner had kept filing cabinets and storage shelving. The cabinets had been forced. The shelving units had been searched. Papers were scattered across the floor. They were looking for documents, Sal said. "I know what they were looking for," I said. Ray arrived 20 minutes after I called him, dressed alert, carrying his leather folio, moving through the small cluster of officers with the particular confidence of a man who knows his purpose in a scene and how to establish it quickly. He spoke briefly with the detective handling the call, showed his credentials and his connection to the property dispute currently before the court, and was given access to the interior. I stood in the doorway and looked at what had been done to the place. The filing cabinets were open drawers pulled out at angles, their contents distributed across the concrete floor in loose overlapping layers. The shelving along the back wall had been cleared, not destroyed, just methodically emptied. Contents examined and set aside or scattered, depending on whether whoever was searching had found them useful. It had the look of a purposeful search rather than random disorder. Someone had known what categories of information to look for. Someone had given instructions. I stood in the doorway in the cold November dawn and looked at it and felt something settle into me that was colder than the morning air and different from anger. Anger is hot. Anger moves. What I felt standing there was the particular cold stillness that arrives when you understand clearly and without any remaining room for doubt, that the person on the other side of this situation was willing to burn everything down to protect themselves, that there was no floor to how far they would go, that the garage, which had already been taken once, was still in their calculation a loose end that needed to be managed. It was the 3rd time they had reached into something that belonged to me. The first time they'd taken the building itself, the second time they'd sent a piece of concrete through my bedroom window. And now this 2 men in the dark, going through the remnants of 40 years of records looking for anything that might be used or destroyed, or simply removed from the equation. Ray came back out to where I was standing. "The security camera on the building across the alley covers this section of the block," he said. He said it the way he said most things matter-of-factly without announcement. "The property management company is pulling the overnight footage now. The detective has formally requested it." He paused. "Based on the initial framing of what the camera covers, we should have a clear record of the vehicle used the time of arrival." And, a brief pause, a phone call made from outside the building approximately 8 minutes before the entry. The caller's face was visible. I looked at him. "Tiffany," I said. Ray didn't confirm it out loud. He didn't need to. His expression said everything his professional caution wouldn't let his voice say. "What I will tell you," he said, "is that whoever ordered this just handed us a criminal case wrapped in a bow. Forced entry destruction of records relevant to active litigation, evidence of coordination." He closed his folio. "This moves beyond a civil dispute. The district attorney's office is going to have questions." I turned back toward the interior of the garage, the scattered papers, the forced drawers, the methodical disorder of a search conducted by people who believed they had nothing to lose. I thought about my father's words about the garage, the things he'd said about what the place was worth, what it represented, what it meant to protect something real. I thought about standing at this same threshold 40 years ago, 20 years ago, last week, and all the different versions of what it had meant to walk through this door. I didn't say any of that out loud. Some things you keep. My phone buzzed at 7:12, Derek's name on the screen. I looked at it for a moment, still standing at the garage entrance Ray a few feet away, and then I made a decision. I let it go to the message function. 30 seconds later, the notification appeared. I opened it and read it once, then held the phone out to Ray. He read it. His expression stayed neutral, but something shifted slightly behind his eyes. May I, he said, meaning the phone. Go ahead, I said. He stepped away and dialed. I watched him from across the sidewalk, his posture, the way he stood when he was listening carefully, the small adjustments in his expression as the conversation moved through, whatever it moved through. 3 minutes roughly, maybe a few seconds more. When he came back, he looked at me in a way he hadn't looked at me before in all of this, with something that was close to surprise. Not alarm, just the quiet recalibration of a man who had just received information that didn't fit the model he'd been working from. Frank, he said, Derek wants to come in to my office. He paused. Without Tiffany. I looked past him at the garage, the forced door, the scattered floor, the cold gray light of a November morning coming through the windows and falling across 40 years of records that someone had tried to take from me for the second time. Then I looked at Ray. Set it up, I said. And before we continue, just a quick note, some parts of the story ahead are slightly fictionalized to enhance the narrative, so not every detail reflects reality. If you're enjoying this so far, feel free to share and subscribe for more stories like this. And if it's not your kind of content, you're completely free to stop here. Derek was already in Ray's office when I arrived. He was sitting in the chair across from Ray's desk, with his coat still on, the kind of thing you do when you haven't fully decided whether you're staying. He looked up when I came through the door, and something moved across his face that I didn't try to name. I sat down in the chair beside him, rather than across from him. I don't know exactly why I made that choice. It felt like the right geometry for what was about to happen. For the first time since I'd come home, I was looking at my son without Tiffany somewhere in the room. Without the careful management of a presence that knew how to shape a conversation before it started. He looked younger than he had in his own living room 11 days ago, and older than the version of him I kept in my memory. He looked more than anything like a man who had not slept properly in a significant number of days. Ray gave us a moment, then he opened his notepad and said quietly, Derek, whenever you're ready. Derek started at the beginning, which I hadn't expected. Not the most recent events, not the SEC letter or the USB in his jacket pocket, but 8 months ago, when Tiffany had first brought the plan to him. He described it the way someone describes a decision they've been reconstructing in their head, looking for the exact moment where a different choice was possible. She had framed it as a family investment, a real estate opportunity with returns that would secure their future, and she had emphasized provide for my retirement. The garage was underperforming as an asset. The neighborhood was changing. The timing was right. Derek had listened to all of it and had felt somewhere underneath the logic that something was misaligned. But she had answers for every hesitation, and the answers were always reasonable. And eventually reasonable had won. I knew something wasn't right, he said to the desk rather than to me. I didn't look at it too closely because I didn't want to find out what it was. He said it without making an excuse of it. I gave him credit for that. The SEC letter arrived on the Friday before our Sunday meeting in the parking lot. The development project Tiffany had directed their investment into was under federal scrutiny for misrepresentation to investors specifically. Claims made about permits and projected returns that the documentation did not support. Derek had read the letter 3 times before calling Tiffany, and her response, calm, structured, already prepared, had been the thing that finally broke through. She wasn't surprised, he said. That's when I understood. She already knew. She knew before we put the garage money in. He reached into his jacket and placed a small USB drive on Ray's desk. He set it down with the particular care of someone who has been carrying it for days and isn't sure how to let go of it. Everything is on there. he said. Her email threads with the developer, the timeline of the acquisition, the internal communication showing when she first learned about the federal inquiry. A pause. She knew 8 months before the SEC letter reached us. She moved the garage sale forward specifically to get the capital in before the investigation became public. Ray picked up the drive and set it beside his notepad. He didn't open his laptop yet. He looked at Derek steadily. "You understand what cooperating fully means," Ray said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Derek said. "Complete disclosure, full availability for investigators, documented testimony against all parties." Ray's voice was even without judgment. "In exchange, I will file for a cooperation agreement. Given the circumstances, your documented position as a secondary party who was misled about material facts, the district attorney's office will likely consider immunity or a suspended finding. I cannot guarantee that outcome, but the evidence supports the argument strongly." Derek nodded. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at me. I had been sitting beside him through all of it without speaking. I still didn't speak. I looked at my son, 38 years old, coat still on, hands folded on his knees, and I thought about the distance between the person sitting next to me now and the person who had stood in his living room less than 2 weeks ago, polished and certain. While his wife explained my life back to me, I thought about how long it takes for the version of a situation you've been given to finally crack open and show you what was underneath it the whole time. I didn't say anything, but I put my hand briefly on his shoulder, the way his grandfather used to do, and then I took it away and we moved forward. 8 days passed between the morning Derek handed Ray that drive and the afternoon we walked into Multnomah County Courthouse. Ray filed an emergency motion the following morning, attaching the USB evidence, the security camera documentation from the break-in, and the cooperation agreement in progress. In Multnomah County, emergency motions carrying evidence of criminal activity and active civil proceedings receive prioritized scheduling. The hearing date came back within 48 hours. I used those 8 days to do ordinary things. I bought a new bedroom window. I had coffee with Jean at Dunning's on the Saturday in between. I went to Jimmy's shop and spent an afternoon with the Harley, not working on it, just sitting nearby. Waiting has its own kind of preparation. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected for the weight of what it held. Wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, slightly warmer than the hospital, kinda gallery with maybe 30 seats. Jean, Pete Soul, and Marcus were in the back row. When I arrived, all 4 of them in the same clothes they might have worn to a serious church service, which for men like us was the appropriate register for a day like this. Judge Carol Whitfield came in at 2 in the afternoon and established from the first minutes that she had read the filings in full and had questions. Ray presented the case in the order he had built it. The irrevocable trust from 1993, the fraudulent power of attorney, the February timeline showing premeditated planning, the Leonard Hayes documentation from Phoenix, the break-in footage, and Derek's cooperation agreement with its attached evidence. He spoke for 31 minutes without raising his voice once. Tiffany sat at the opposing table and conferred in low, continuous murmurs with her attorney throughout Ray's presentation. I watched the judge's expression shift in increments across those 31 minutes, not dramatically, not in the visible way of courtroom drama, but in the quiet way of someone whose temperature is dropping with each new document placed in the record. When Tiffany's attorney rose to respond, the judge asked 3 questions. The attorney answered the first one. The second one took longer. By the third, the murmuring at the opposing table had stopped entirely. Judge Whitfield looked at Tiffany directly, not at her attorney, not at her paperwork, and said in a voice that carried no particular emotion because it didn't need to. The evidence before this court reflects a pattern of conduct that extends well beyond the scope of this filing and this room. Then she picked up her gavel. This matter is referred to the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. The petition for conservatorship is dismissed with prejudice. The property transfer is vacated pending formal reversion proceedings. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down once, clean and final. I turned and found Gene's eyes across the gallery. He gave one slow nod. I gave one back. That was enough. The November air outside the courthouse was cold and clean, and exact the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. I stopped on the steps and took one slow breath all the way in, all the way out. The first time I had managed that without something pressing against my chest since the morning I came home 3 weeks ago. Tiffany left through the side exit with her attorney, 2 figures moving efficiently toward the next calculation. She didn't look back once. I watched her go and felt mostly nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Derek was at the far edge of the parking area, alone, hands in his pockets, looking at something that wasn't there. Gene appeared at my shoulder. "What are you going to do about the boy?" he said. "I don't know yet," I said. Gene nodded. That was the right answer, and he knew it. Ray found me before I reached my truck. Collar turned up folio under his arm, the quiet satisfaction of a man who has seen a long piece of work reach its proper end. "The transfer is vacated," he said. 42 days for the paperwork to clear completely fast for Oregon property reversion. He paused. "The developer has filed suit against Derek and Tiffany jointly to recover his capital. That's their problem now, not yours." I looked across the lot at Derek's figure, still standing at the edge. "He's going to have a hard few months," I said. "Yes," Ray said. "He is." He shook my hand firm brief and walked to his car. I stood in the November cold and watched Derek until he finally got in his own car and drove away. Then I drove home. 6 weeks of paperwork and patience followed. County filings, title, reversion, documents, coordination between offices and carriers and court clerks. Ray handled the machinery of it. I signed what needed signing and otherwise went about ordinary living the way you do, when the emergency is over, but the work isn't finished yet. On a Tuesday in early December, Derek sent a short message. "No preamble, I'm sorry, Dad. I know that's not enough. I'm working on what comes after it." I read it twice and didn't answer that day. 3 days later, I wrote back, "I heard you. The door isn't closed." That was true, and it was everything I knew how to say at that point. December 24th arrived quietly the way important days sometimes do. I drove to the garage alone in the early afternoon, with the keys Ray had returned via plain envelope 2 days prior. I parked on the street and sat for a moment, looking at the building, the new sign gone, just the bare mounting brackets left behind, like punctuation after a deleted sentence. I unlocked the door and rolled it up with both hands the way I had 10,000 times and stepped inside. Empty. Swept clean. No equipment, no shelving, no 40 years of accumulated work. Just concrete and bare walls and the overhead lights running down the center. But underneath the cleaned concrete still there, the faint compound of motor oil and metal and decades of careful work. A place holds on to what it has been, even after everything visible is removed. Like a person that way. I stood in the middle of the floor and let the quiet be what it was. Then I heard the first car outside. Gene came through with my old steel toolbox, the one with the repaired latch he'd kept at his house since August. He set it on the concrete and looked around the space and nodded once. Pete followed with the wooden stool from beside the main workbench, slightly uneven on the back leg, and placed it exactly where it had always been. Sal carried the framed photograph my father in the garage doorway the year he bought the place, arms crossed work shirt. The neighborhood unrecognizable around him, and leaned it against the wall beneath where it had always hung. Marcus came last with the old portable radio bent antenna, and all found an outlet and turned it on low. Something unhurried came out of it. The 4 of them stood in the empty space with what they had saved, and nobody said anything. There was nothing to say that the being there wasn't already saying. I laughed a real one, the kind that releases something you didn't know you were still holding. It surprised me. They laughed with me, which is the only correct response to that kind of laugh. The last time I had laughed like that was before Minnesota, before all of it. It felt like something returning to where it belonged. We were still there, radio playing low toolbox on the floor, the 4 of us in that half-empty space that smelled faintly of everything it had ever been, when headlights swept slowly across the back wall. I recognized the idle and shut-down pattern of the engine before the door opened. The Brotherhood went quiet without any signal. Gene took a step back. The others found reasons to look elsewhere. I turned toward the entrance. My son was standing at the garage door on Christmas Eve, both hands in his trouser pockets, the cold street behind him. He was looking at me with the expression that asks a question it doesn't know how to form yet. The one that wants to know whether there's still a place here for the person wearing it. He wasn't sure if he was allowed to come in. He didn't come in on Christmas Eve. I found that out 2 days later when he told me. He had driven past sometime after 9 when the Brotherhood had gone home, and I was alone in the garage with the radio still playing low and the toolbox on the floor. He'd seen the light through the gap at the bottom of the roll-up door. He'd slowed down. He'd sat at the curb for a few minutes, engine running. Then he'd driven away. I didn't think I had the right, he said. Not yet. It took him 2 days to decide he did. December 26th was a Friday. Gray and cold in the way Portland does. The tail end of the year, not dramatically, just honestly. He knocked on the side door at 2:30 in the afternoon, which I thought said something about him. He could have walked in through the open roll-up. He knocked instead. I opened it. We looked at each other in the way of two people who have been through something large together and are still working out which parts of the landscape have shifted permanently and which parts are the same as before. Come in, I said. He came in. We stood in the garage, the two of us, and the distance between us, which had the exact dimensions of everything that had happened. He looked around the space slowly, the wooden stool in its place beside the workbench position, the frame photograph leaning against the wall, the old toolbox on the floor with its repaired latch, things he had grown up with, things that had been somewhere else and were now back where they belonged. Something moved across his face when he looked at them. I didn't name it. Some things you give room to exist without labeling them. He turned back to me and started to speak, and I let him. I didn't guide it, didn't shape it, didn't help him find the words. He had to bring them himself, and he did. He said he was sorry. He said it simply, and without the kind of careful construction that means a person has rehearsed their apology to make it easier to deliver. He said it like it cost him something, which is the only version of sorry that means anything. Then he talked about Tiffany, not to explain himself, not entirely, but because it was part of the honest account, and he was trying to give me that. He talked about how the plan had been presented to him, the logic had arrived in the way each reasonable-sounding step had made the next one feel possible. He talked about the moment somewhere in the middle of it, when he had understood that something was wrong and how he had chosen in that moment not to look at it directly. I told myself it was an investment, he said. For us, for the future. I told myself you'd understand eventually when the returns came in. He paused. I was telling myself a story. I knew I was. I just didn't stop. The garage was quiet around us. The old radio was off. Outside the street made its ordinary sounds, a car passing a dog somewhere, the low ambient hum of a city going about its December Friday. I know you weren't the whole of what happened, Derek, I said, but you were a part of it, and that part is going to take time. I looked at him steadily. Not forever, but time. That's honest. He nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't offer reasons why the timeline should be shorter. He just received it, which was the right thing to do. We stood there for a moment in the particular quiet that follows an honest thing being said. Then I turned and walked toward the far corner of the garage. The Harley was there. Jimmy had brought it over the week before. The reversion was finalized carefully in the bed of his truck, wrapped the same way he'd stored it. It sat in the corner under the white canvas drop cloth, which I had not yet removed because I was waiting for the right moment, and the right moment had not arrived until now. I took hold of the canvas and pulled it back. Derek went still. He knew the motorcycle existed. He'd grown up knowing about it, the way kids know about things that belong to grandparents as objects of inherited significance that they have never quite understood. He had been to Jimmy's shop twice asking about it, which I knew, and which Jimmy had handled the way Jimmy handled most things that needed handling directly and without accommodation. What he hadn't known was that it was here, in this garage, under this particular cloth, on this particular night. He walked toward it slowly and crouched down beside the lower section of the frame, the area where the subtube ran beneath the backbone. He looked at it for a long moment, the way someone looks at a thing when they're fitting new information over the top of what they thought they knew. Grandfather put the trust document in the frame, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, I said. That's why you asked Jimmy to keep it. He was still looking at the frame. That's why Ray asked where it was. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he planned for this, not this exactly, but someone trying to take it. He planned for that. He was a careful man, I said. He thought about what he was leaving and who might want it, and how to make sure it stayed where he intended. I looked at the motorcycle, at the chrome, and the aged paint, and the shape of something built to last. He never told me the document was in there. He just told me to keep the bike. Said I'd know when I needed to know. Derek straightened up and looked at me. I didn't know who she was, he said. Before. What she'd done before. I know, I said. That's not an excuse. No, I said. It's not, but it's a fact, and facts matter when you're trying to understand something honestly. I held his gaze. You have some work ahead of you, Derek. Legal work and the other kind. Neither one is going to be easy. He nodded. I know. I walked back to the center of the garage and stood there between the door and the Harley, between my son and everything else, and said the thing I had been working towards since December 24th when I saw headlights on the back wall and recognized the sound of his engine. The door is open, I said. That's what I can give you right now. It isn't nothing. A door being open isn't nothing, but it isn't everything either. You'll have to walk through it yourself. I can't do that part. Derek stood beside his grandfather's motorcycle in the cold garage light and looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, slowly. The nod of a person who has received something real and understands the weight of it. He picked up his jacket from where he'd draped it over the stool. He walked to the side door and opened it, and stopped there for a moment with his back to me, the December night coming in around him, the street visible beyond his shoulder. Then he walked out. The door stayed open behind him. I hadn't moved to close it. The light from the street lamp fell in across the concrete floor in a long, pale rectangle, and I stood in the middle of the garage and listened to the sound of his footsteps until they reached his car, and then until the engine turned over, and until the sound of it moved down the street, and eventually became part of the general quiet. The door stayed open. I left it that way. The last morning of the year arrived the way good things sometimes do, without fanfare, without announcement, just there when you looked up. I got to Dunning's at 7. The sky outside was the particular shade of gray-white that December does in Portland, when it hasn't decided yet whether to rain, not threatening, just considering. I pulled into the same spot I had always used, walked to the door, heard the 2-note bell above the frame, and smelled the dark roast and the faint sweetness of the morning's first bake coming from the kitchen. They were all already there. Gene with his coffee, Pete with his hands around his mug, and that way he was warming something more than his palms. Sal sitting straight, watching the street through the window, the way he always did, the habit of 30 years, not going anywhere. Marcus with his slow considering expression, the one that meant he was listening to something nobody else could hear yet. My chair was empty. I sat down in it. Nobody made a thing of it. Beverly came over without being asked and set a black coffee in front of me and went back to the counter. The table settled into its usual shape. 5 men a corner, the morning outside, doing what mornings do. We talked about ordinary things. Pete's youngest had come home for the holiday and was already showing signs of leaving again, which Pete described with the particular mixture of pride and resignation that fathers develop when their children turn out independent. Sal had found a crack in his driveway that the frost had opened up and was debating whether to patch it himself or admit that his knees weren't what they'd been and call someone. Gene had a truck making a sound he didn't like, which he described in enough mechanical detail that we all arrived at the same diagnosis without any of us saying it out loud. Marcus said very little, which was usual. He listened and drank his coffee and occasionally added a sentence that landed quietly and stayed in the room after everything else had moved on. Outside, the street ran its ordinary morning current. A delivery truck idling at the light, a woman walking a dog that had strong opinions about a particular telephone pole, a city bus pulling away from the stop on the far corner. The unremarkable procession of a Wednesday morning on the last day of December, which is to say exactly what it needed to be. I hadn't known how much I had missed this specific thing until I was back inside it. Beverly came back to the table about 40 minutes in, when the conversation had settled into one of its comfortable silences. She was holding a small envelope, business-sized, slightly thick, and she set it on the table in front of me with the careful manner of someone who has been keeping something and is glad to finally deliver it. "Came in just before Christmas," she said. "I recognized your name, kept it behind the counter until you came in." I looked at it. The return address said Rochester, Minnesota. The handwriting was deliberate, the careful, slightly effortful penmanship of a person for whom writing takes more concentration than it once did. Each letter formed with attention. I knew who it was before I opened it. Inside was a folded newspaper clipping and a small piece of notepaper. I read the clipping first. It was a brief article from a Minnesota regional paper, a few column inches not prominently placed, the kind of story that doesn't make headlines but matters to the people it describes. A case involving the financial exploitation of an elderly man by family members, a civil judgment upheld, a criminal referral sustained, the family named, the outcome documented. Underneath the clipping in the same deliberate handwriting as the address was a note, short enough to fit on half a piece of notepaper. "Told you so. The system remembers when you make it remember. Keep well, Frank. H." I set the note down on the table. I kept my hand on it for a moment. Outside, the delivery truck had moved on, and the street was quieter. I thought about a hospital corridor in Rochester at 2 a.m, and a man sitting on a bench in his hospital gown who had told me with the authority of someone who had lived it. Exactly how these things worked. I thought about sitting in a bed in room 14B and saying with the certainty of a man who hadn't learned yet, my son would never do that. Harold had not said "I told you so" in a mean way. He had said it the way one man says it to another when they've both been through something and come out the other side standing, which is a different thing entirely. I sat with it for a moment. "That's good news," Gene said. He wasn't pushing, just asking in the way of someone who has the right to ask and knows not to press. "From a friend," I said. Gene nodded. He picked up his coffee. Nobody asked anything else. Nobody needed to. I left Dunning's just before 9. The morning had brightened slightly while we were inside. Not sunshine, not in Portland in December, but a lifting of the gray to something more silver than dark. The kind of light that makes the wet streets look deliberate rather than just damp. I drove to the garage. There was no particular reason I had to go that morning. The garage was open for business, in a technical sense, but I hadn't advertised yet, hadn't taken on any work, hadn't done anything more than bring the space back to itself and let it breathe. I didn't have a car waiting. I didn't have a schedule. I went because I wanted to. I parked on the street, took out the key, and rolled up the door with both hands. The light came in low and long across the concrete floor, the way it does in December, when the sun sits close to the horizon all day. Not overhead, not direct, but angled and steady and reaching a long way into the space. It caught the chrome on the Harley across the room and made it glow in a way that felt for a moment like the building was remembering something. I stood in the doorway and let the smell of the place come to me. It was there, the layers of it, the compound of oil and metal, and years of work faint, but present already deeper than it had been a week ago. A place comes back to itself gradually when you give it the conditions to do so. Like a lot of things. I walked to the toolbox Gene's delivery, the steel one, with the repaired latch, and crouched down and opened it. The tools were arranged the way I had arranged them the last time I'd put them away, which was before Minnesota, before all of it. Each one in its place, unchanged. I reached in and picked up the wrench from the tray in the lid. A standard combination wrench, nothing particular about it, the handle worn smooth in the right places from a few decades of regular use. I stood up and held it. There was no car in the garage, no project waiting, nothing to fix today. I stood in the low December light with the wrench in my hand and looked at the space around me, the bare walls that would eventually have things on them again, the empty bays that would eventually have machines in them again, the open door at my back letting in the cold morning air and the sound of the street and the particular quality of light that belongs only to the last day of a year that had asked more of me than most. I thought about what I wanted to say, not to Derek, not to Ray, not to Gene or Pete or Sal or Marcus, not to any specific person, just what I wanted to say now that there was finally room to say it. Now that the noise had settled and the dust had come down, and I was standing in my own garage on my own floor with my own wrench in my hand on the last morning of the year, I stood there and let the garage breathe around me, and I began. The garage was empty. Not the empty of abandonment, not the cold, sealed quality of a place no one has cared about. This was different. The empty of a space that has been cleared and is waiting. The way a page is empty before you know what to write on it. I walked the perimeter the way I always had, one circuit of the space, before the work began to see what the day was asking for. My boots on the concrete made the same sound they always had in here, a solid, unhurried echo. The walls had always returned at exactly this angle. I ran my hand along the east wall as I walked. Someone had repainted it a commercial gray trying to be neutral. But beneath my fingers at intervals, I felt the slight resistance of old nail holes. Dozens of them spaced in the arrangement of tools that had hung in the same positions for decades. The wall remembered the layout even after everything had been removed. Even after someone had painted over the evidence. Some things don't fully disappear just because you cover them. I stopped at the center of the floor. There was a stain near the main bay position, a large irregular darkening of the concrete spread in an uneven radius from where the primary drain had always been. Oil. 40 years of it worked into the porous surface in layers. No cleaning agent removes that kind of accumulation. You can lighten it at the surface. But after enough years, the stain becomes part of the floor itself, rather than something on top of it. 4 decades of work compressed into a shadow on the ground. I crouched down and put one hand flat on the concrete beside it, not on the stain itself, just near it. My father had crouched over this same floor. His hands had worked above this same drain. The tools whose ghost holes remained in the east wall had passed through his hands before they passed through mine. I thought about the decision he had made in 1993, the document he had written out by hand, rolled carefully sealed in a length of pipe, and tucked inside the frame of a motorcycle he knew I would keep. He hadn't told me it was there. He had just told me to keep the bike and trusted that when the moment arrived, I would find what I needed. That was a different kind of preparation than a safe or a lock. It was the preparation of a man who understood that the things worth protecting need to be placed where only the right kind of attention will find them. He thought in systems. He understood that a good design anticipates failure without advertising its defenses. The smartest man I ever knew, and he spent his life covered in grease and never once seemed to mind. I thought about Harold, the man in the room beside mine in Minnesota, who had told me from inside his own experience exactly what the opening move of this kind of situation looked like. I had listened and then said my son would never do that. Harold had stayed quiet in the way of someone who knows certain lessons can only be learned from the inside. He was right. I learned it from the inside. But here is what I also learned, that the system remembers when you make it remember. That a man with clear documentation, the right attorney, and 4 friends who kept photographs and stayed up all night in their cars outside his house is not as alone as the people trying to isolate him believe. I thought about Jean Pete Sal and Marcus the chair that was always empty when I wasn't in it. The 47 photographs, the business card placed on the table without ceremony. The kind of loyalty that doesn't announce itself, that just shows up and stays. I straightened up and looked at the space around me, bare walls, empty bays, the open door at the far end, letting in the December morning and the year's last light. This place needed work, a new workbench, fresh shelving, a parts cabinet to replace the one that had been taken. Small repairs, large ones, the gradual process of returning a space to what it was built to be. That would take time. But I had relearned since my father told me this in a different form long ago, that the things worth having always take time. Here is what I know, now that I did not know clearly enough before. When the people who are supposed to love you begin to see you as something to be managed or converted into a more useful form, they have stopped seeing you. They have started pricing you. And the moment you stop being useful, the calculation changes. You become an obstacle rather than a person. That is not love. That is administration. My father didn't leave me a document to protect a piece of real estate. He left me a document that said, "This belongs to you." No one has the authority to decide what it's worth except the person it was given to. He left me a document that said, "You belong to yourself." That is what I am carrying out of this year. If you are listening and you recognize something in it, if you have felt the particular cold of being evaluated by someone who is supposed to love you, Find your documentation. Find your attorney. Find your Gene, your Pete, your Sal, your Marcus. They exist. They are in your life already waiting to be given the chance. And if you are a Derek, if you are somewhere inside a decision you made and are still inside the door, is still open. I left it that way. When you're ready to walk through it, you'll find what was there before any of this started. A garage, a wrench, someone willing to show you what needs doing. The wrench was still in my hand. I looked down at it, the worn grip, the familiar weight of something used correctly for a long time. Outside the last morning of the year was doing what it does, being ordinary, being present, letting the light in through the open door and fall across the concrete in the long, pale way of winter. And underneath it all, faint stubborn, returning to where it had always belonged, the smell of motor oil. The door was open. I had work to do. I'm 64 years old. I built something with my hands over 40 years, and the people I loved most nearly took it from me while I was lying in a hospital bed fighting to stay healthy. That's my family story. I'm not proud of all of it, but I'm not ashamed to tell it either, because I think some of you need to hear it. Here is what I want to say, directly. If someone in your family is treating you like an asset to be liquidated, a problem to be managed, a resource to be used up before you expire, that is not love. That is inventory management, and you deserve better than to be counted. Don't do what I did. Don't wait until the locks are changed and the sign is different and you're standing on your own sidewalk feeling like a stranger. Don't assume that blood means safety. Don't confuse someone's familiarity with your life for their right to make decisions about it. Family betrayal doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in quietly dressed in the language of investment and opportunity. And we did this for you. My father knew something I had to learn the hard way, that the things worth protecting need to be placed where only the right hands will find them. He didn't leave me real estate. He left me a document that said, "You belong to yourself. No one can sell that without your consent." I believe God puts people in our path at exactly the right moment. Harold, a stranger in a hospital corridor. Ray, an attorney I'd known for 20 years without knowing I'd need him. 4 men who kept a chair empty and 47 photographs in a jacket pocket. I don't think that's coincidence. I think that's something looking out for the people who are paying attention. This is a family story about what happens when loyalty is replaced by calculation. But it's also a story about what holds when everything else is taken. The people who show up without being asked, who stay without being told to, who hand you a coffee through a car window at 6 a.m. and don't say a word about why they're there. Find those people, keep them close, and document everything. Family betrayal is survivable. I am proof of that. But survival is not accidental. It requires records, witnesses, and at least one person in your corner who doesn't flinch. That's everything I have for you today. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have done. Standing in that parking lot, would you have handed your son that folder or walked away? I genuinely want to know how you see it. If this family story stayed with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Quick note, while this story draws from real themes around elder financial abuse and family betrayal, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this isn't your kind of content, no hard feelings, there's plenty more to explore. I'll see you in the next one.